Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. Our last couple videos have been on calculation, and I thought we'd do a little bit more on calculation. In this case, we're going to look at some calculation errors that were made, and we'll look at what could have been done and maybe how it could have been done a little bit better, both from student games and recent games. All right, let's take a look at this position. My student was white, and my student had just played bishop to d6, taking advantage of the pinned e-pawn and attacking the e-pawn and the rook on c5. It was black's turn. Black could just move the rook, but notice if he moves the rook on c5, then he can't guard the pawn on e7. So black calculated and said, maybe I can counterattack instead of moving the rook. Maybe I can attack my opponent's rook. So black decided to counterattack by playing bishop takes c3. All right, so now it was my student's turn. When somebody takes a piece off the board, if there's only one way to recapture and you don't have any intermediate zwischenzugs like a check or something, the normal thing to do is not take too much time and just make the recapture. And here that would imply that white should play b takes c3. But when you have multiple captures, then things get more difficult. Now, one thing that makes it easy, though, is black has just taken a piece off the board. So you can't really fool around too much and not take anything here because it would give black a chance to save everything. For instance, suppose you decide, I'm not going to take anything. I'll just counterattack by, taking my rook that's attacked on e1 and attacking his knight on g4. If you play rook e4, then things get a little complicated because now black has multiple choices on how to save things, and he's already up a piece. So even though a move like rook e4 might be a candidate move, in most cases, if this was a speed game, almost no good player would play a move like that because they don't want to give black a chance to consolidate when he's already up a piece. For instance, black might just be able to give back the piece and end up winning a pawn by simply saving a piece somewhere. So rook e4 is not a ridiculous move, but generally you want to take something in this position. We could spend time analyzing rook e4. We could say, well, if rook e4, if black simply plays rook to d5 to counterattack the bishop, then what do? We could play rook pawn takes bishops, b takes c3. And then if black plays rook takes d6, we could play rook takes g4, but then it would be black's turn, and he would go after those isolated pawns. Black could also, after rook e4, play knight f6, attacking the rook. You might say, well, that pawn is still pinned. We could play rook takes f6. But notice after rook e4, some people say, oh, Dan, I'm not very good at visualization. You have to draw lines. Rook e4, knight f6. If you play rook takes f6, it's guarded by the bishop, and that's going to be losing. So rook e4, knight f6 is problematic because you're still down a piece, and now the knight is counterattacking the rook. So that's just an example of why you probably wouldn't spend a lot of time looking at moves like rook e4. What does that mean? It means you want to take something. Well, normally, as I said, you want to take back on the square where someone just took, but if that's not the only square where you can take, you have other candidate moves as well. So here, the moves that white could play would be b takes c3, simply recapturing, but he could also play bishop takes c5, taking the rook anyway, or he could play something like rook takes e7 check. Again, the problem with rook takes e7 check is after rook takes e7, bishop takes, let's say, e7, it's black's turn and black's up a piece, and even though his rook is attacked and his bishop is attacked, he can do things like counterattack the bishop and make things complicated for white. In this case, maybe white can get away with that. So rook takes e7 is a candidate move, but again, probably better to take something. If you take something first, then he has to take back, and that gives you the initiative. You usually get an extra tempo if you're the one taking first. If you let him take first, if you play rook takes e7, that's not taking a piece, that's only taking a pawn. Then black is up a piece, and he gets a chance to decide whether he wants to recapture or whether he wants to take things. So rook takes e7 check is not a ridiculous move. But again, the main moves would probably be b takes c3 and bishop takes c5. So let's take a look at those moves as well. All right, let's start with the immediate recapture, just simply b takes c3. And now the idea is that the rook on c5 cannot guard the pawn on e7. So what black would do is black would probably just simply play rook takes c3, and then white would take on e7. If he takes with the bishop, it's not terrible. He could also play rook f7 check after b takes c3, rook takes c3. But then the king would play king g8, hit the rook on f7. One of the rooks would have to take on e7 to save the rook. And what we would see in that position would be white would be in the endgame up a pawn, and he'd have that isolated a pawn as the extra pawn. So b takes c3, rook takes c3, let's say rook takes e7 check, rook takes e7, bishop takes e7, and then black could play something like maybe, he could play something like rook to c7, hitting the bishop, followed by maybe rook to a7, putting the rook in front of the passed pawn, things like that. White can always throw in a rook f7 check at some point, but it's not going to do very much. So after b takes c3, after b takes c3, rook takes c3, rook takes e7 check, rook takes e7, bishop takes e7, white is up and isolated past a pawn in an endgame with a rook and a bishop against a knight and a rook. Now, in endgames like this, where you have pawns on both sides of the board, bishops are better than knights because a bishop can keep an eye on both sides of the board at the same time, while a knight can pretty much only go to one side or the other. So that's a pleasant endgame, but just because something is good doesn't mean something else is better. I see people do this kind of logic mistake all the time. I did an earlier video called Chess is Not a Zero-Sum Game, meaning that if you look at three moves A, B, and C, and you don't like A and you don't like B, that doesn't make C good because it doesn't have to add up to 0. A can be bad, B can be bad, and then C could be even worse. So you never want to use deductive logic and say, well, if A is bad and B is bad, I'll take C. And the same thing works with goodness. In this case, if B takes C3, rook takes C3, rook takes E7 check, rook takes E7, bishop takes E7 is good for white, that doesn't mean he doesn't have something better. It just means you can always fall back on that. And when you can fall back on something, it becomes your king of the hill. So the king of the hill is the best thing you found so far. So after B takes C3, rook takes C3, rook takes E7 check, rook takes E7, bishop takes E7, white is much better, and we could put that in your pocket and say, all right, that's the best thing we found so far. Probably a lot better than rook E4, knight F6, or even trying to do something fancier first. But now we need to look at bishop takes c5. Just because b takes c3 gives us a nice endgame doesn't mean bishop takes c5 isn't a lot better. So let's look at bishop takes c5. Now we're taking a rook, but of course he's going to take your rook as well to try to get back at least some of the material. So the line is going to go bishop takes c5, and then there's no doubt that black's going to play bishop takes e1. Then white would recapture rook takes e1. There's only one recapture, and at that point black could not play knight f2 check. The bishop on c5 would be guarding the f2 square, but even if he could, knight f2 check would just force the king into the middle where the king wants to be anyway. So at that point, black would have his e-pawn attacked twice. So again, we're looking at the line, bishop takes c5, bishop takes e1, rook takes e1. Black needs to save his e-pawn, and the only way to do that would be to push it. So he could push it 1 to e6, so the bishop wouldn't attack it, or he could push it 2 to e5, so the knight and the rook could guard it. And since it's a passed pawn, and it's not in any great danger, probably pushing it 2 would be the most likely move. So now we're looking at a sequence like bishop takes c5, bishop takes e1, rook takes e1, e5. Now the position is relatively quiescent, which means there's no more checks, captures, or threats of consequence, which enables us at that point to evaluate the position. Well, before we had an extra pawn, we had an a pawn, and black had no e pawn. So again, let's compare the two positions. The one quiescent position is b takes c3, rook takes c3, rook takes e7 check, rook takes e7, bishop takes e7. This is the one endgame that you could get into, where white has a nice extra outside pawn. He'll be able to put his rook behind that pawn, rook to a1, and start trying to push the pawn down the board. And the knight's not a great place to stop it, but it is an isolated pawn, and the black rook will easily be able to get in front of that pawn. Let's compare that to the line we just looked at. We have, by the way, when you're playing slow chess, if you're playing, a 10-minute game, you don't have time to do this. But the problem with playing a bunch of 10-minute games is you never really learn how to do this kind of stuff. When I first started playing, excuse me, all my games were like 50 moves in 2 hours. So I learned to take my time and visualize these kind of positions and compare them. Finding good moves in chess is all about comparing moves. You're comparing sequences to see which one gives you the best position. So here we have bishop takes c5, bishop takes e1, rook takes e1, e5. In both positions, white has an extra pawn. In one case, it's 3 pawns against 2. In the other case, it's 4 against 3. Now, you might say, well, trades are good for the side that's winning. It's better to be 3 against 2 than 4 against 3. But that's not necessarily so for a couple of reasons. One reason is we're not trading pieces. We're actually trading off an extra pawn. And secondly, here in this position, white has connected passed pawns. Black's passed pawn is isolated. Also, notice black's passed pawn on the e-file can easily be fought against with the king. The king can get in front of that pawn at some point and help blockade that pawn. Isolated pawns are not that easy to get down the board if your opponent has pieces that can blockade them. On the other hand, white has connected passed pawns here. In the other line, he had isolated pawn on the a-file. And here the pawns can guard each other and help each other up the board. For instance, suppose white starts pushing the pawn here. Let's say he plays a4 and just starts pushing those pawns down the board. This pawn's not really going anywhere, as we already said. White can keep a good eye on that pawn. It's hard for the knight to help it. It's not impossible, but right now the bishop and the rook are doing a good job already. But meanwhile, if black decides to play defense instead of offense, if he goes after this pawn, white could either guard it with the pawn and then later on get ready to push it some more and go after this pawn, or white could put his rook behind the pawn and get ready to push the pawns really, really fast here. And again, the black pawn's really not doing much. If he goes there, we can play there. If he says, oh, I'll give you a check, we can just take the rook off the board. So things aren't that easy here, and these connected passed pawns are very, very powerful. So what we're seeing here is that connected passed pawns, 2-to-1, in this case, 2 connected passed pawns versus 1 isolated pawn, is a much bigger advantage than having just 1 isolated pawn against no passed pawn. So I'm going to turn on the engine and let's compare the 2 lines we just looked at. Let's go back. All right. I'll turn on the engine. You can't see it. I'll just read it for you. And the engine says, if you play b takes c3, rook takes c3, rook, even here, rook takes e7 check is not the best move. It actually says white should play a4. It says if you take the pawn, you should take it with the bishop. But in this case, white's advantage is only 0.4 to 0.5. If we look at the other line, where you play bishop takes c5, bishop takes e1, rook takes e1, and e5, it says, yes, white should play a4, and white's advantage, instead of 0.4, 0.5, is 4.1. So the engine actually has the difference as approximately an entire piece, that it's a piece better to have this position than it is to have the other position, even though it looks like from a material count they're almost the same. White's up just 1 pawn. But those connected passed pawns are just monsters. So it's easy to misevaluate the position if you're using some basic criteria like I'd like to trade off, or I'd like to make it more simple, or things like that. But those aren't the key criteria. The real criterion are not only what the material balance is, which in this case would be the same, white's an extra pawn, but how powerful those pawns are, how easily they are pushed, how much of a threat they are to become queens, those kind of things make more difference than, let's say, how simple the position is. In the actual game, my student was afraid to go into that line because he thought the e-pawn would be dangerous for black. So instead of getting the connected pass pawns, he played pawn takes, rook takes, and here he played rook takes e7 check and didn't end up with much of an advantage at all. And eventually the game ended in a draw. And this was the key point of the game. All right, let's take a break here for a second and let me set up another position where a student made a mistake, and we'll take a look at his analysis. All right, here's the position. So my student was black. This was an over-the-board game. And if you look at the material, black is up an entire bishop in this endgame. So an extra piece should be a fairly easy win, but of course you always have to be careful. And one of the things you want to ask yourself in positions like this is, how could I possibly lose the game? And make sure that whatever it is that can't happen, let's say that again, whatever it is that can happen shouldn't happen. So in this case, the first thing my student correctly saw was that white's passed c-pawn was dangerous, and that his bishop, for instance, wasn't in a great spot for trying to stop it, even though his knight was pretty well placed. So he realized that keeping an eye on that pawn was important. But there's other possibilities in the position as well. Because of the awkward position of the black king, you also have to be careful about things like that. So in this position, my student who was black had plenty of time on the clock, and it was white's move, and white played knight to e5. All right, so after knight e5, my student did something that a lot of people do. He asked himself, why did white make that move? That's not a good question to ask yourself, but a lot of people do it. And I try to teach my students that, yes, it makes some sense to ask that question, but actually it's very dangerous and there's much better questions to ask. So he saw that that pawn was dangerous, and he saw that the knight on e5 was guarding the c6 square so that the pawn could now advance before the knight on e7 was stopping the pawn from advancing. So my student in this position, even though I had a lot of time, said, all right, I need to get my rook behind that passed pawn. It's dangerous, but I can't play rook to c4 because he'll take me with the knight. So maybe if I check him and then put my rook on c1, I can keep an eye on that pawn. So he said, I know why he played knight e5. He played knight e5. To get that pawn rolling, I need to stop it. So my student played rook to a1 check. Black played king to g2. My student fairly quickly played rook to c1, and white said, oh, thank you, rook b8 check. And all of a sudden my student realized, oh, knight e5 not only guarded the c6 square, it guards the f7 square. And after rook b8 check, if he puts the knight in the way, knight to c8, then rook takes c8 is checkmate. So in this position, my student resigned, even though 2 moves before he had been up a bishop and he was winning easily. So one of the things I teach people when you're analyzing like this is the 2 questions you want to ask when your opponent makes a move is, 1, is that move safe? In other words, can I just take off his rook or his knight or checkmate him or something? And the second question isn't, why did he make that move? It's, what are all the things that move does? Well, my student was right. It does guard the c6 square and help that pawn come down the board. But that's not the only thing it does. If he, instead of asking why did he make that move and coming to the answer to help the pawn go to c6, if he had said, what are all the things that move does, he would have realized, oh, it not only guards c6, it also guards f7, and that means white's threatening mate with rook to b8 mate. If he had seen all the things that move does, then he would have said, oh, I have moves that could probably stop both. For instance, I could just play rook to a8, get my rook in front of the pawn, block the pawn, and then remaneuver my bishop maybe onto that diagonal and stop the pawn. And of course, he has no mates then. That bark was from my puppy Capa. Oh, there she is again. She's noticing something. I've noticed something too, that there's a mate in the position. Maybe that's what Capa saw. Maybe she's trying to tell me that things were very rough against my student when he didn't see the mate here. So again, one of the morals of the story is don't ask why did someone make a move. Ask what are all the things that move does. For instance, if you ask what are all the things that move does and you come up with some things, it probably includes the why he made that move. Or if your opponent's not very good, it actually may be that the things that you come up with that the move does is more than what your opponent sees, but that's okay. It's better to have more than what he sees than less. All right, guys, enough fighting back there, doggy doos. All right, very good. Well, I guess I can see I'm being called to greater duties here. So I better end the video, but hopefully you got the idea today about A, analyzing the position, being very careful, taking your time, and B, don't just ask why did someone make the move, ask is it safe and what are all the things that move does. This isn't the first time a student asked why did someone make a move, came up with a reason that was very reasonable, and then missed something else and lost the game. It happens all the time. In fact, if you look at my book, Everyone's Second Chess book, I have a chapter called Just Because It's Forced, where you attack something, you force him to make a move, and then you assume, I know why he made that move, because I forced him to, and then you don't realize that you forced him to do something where he can do something else on the next move, and then they miss it because it was forced. Same kind of idea. Those kind of thought process errors are very common in amateur games. Okay, Capa wants me to go. Thanks for enjoying the video. Hopefully you tell your friends about Dan Heisman Chess, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.